I knew something was wrong before I even reached my house. You ever get that feeling where your gut starts telling you a story before your eyes catch up? That's exactly what happened to me. I'd been on the road for 8 straight days, flying between job sites, eating airport food that all tasted the same, sleeping in hotel rooms where every wall looked identical. By the time I finally crossed the county line heading home, all I wanted was to pull into my driveway, unload my truck, let my old Labrador Duke run circles around the yard, and spend the evening doing absolutely nothing. Home had always been the one place where life slowed down. It was the place my grandfather built from the ground up, where my father taught me how to swing a hammer, where every fence post, every tree, every crack in the old porch had a story attached to it. So when I turned onto Briar Creek Road and saw flashing construction signs where there hadn't been any the week before, I figured somebody farther down the subdivision must have been getting a new sidewalk or maybe replacing a water line. It didn't even cross my mind that any of it had something to do with me, until I got closer. I slowed down because something looked off. The mailbox was still there. The oak tree beside it was still standing. My barn was still sitting back against the tree line. But my driveway was gone. Not blocked, not under construction, gone. There was a perfectly smooth strip of brand new concrete stretching across the exact spot where my gravel entrance had been for nearly 40 years, with fresh landscaping already planted along the edges like it had always belonged there. Orange safety cones sat neatly in a row, almost proudly, as if whoever planned the whole thing expected people to admire it. I actually drove 20 yards past my own property before I stopped, because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I backed up slowly, rolled down my window, and just stared. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered to nobody. My pickup, the one I'd left parked beside the garage before catching my flight, was still sitting exactly where I'd left it. Except now it couldn't leave. The sidewalk had sealed off the only entrance onto my property. My truck looked like an exhibit in a museum, trapped behind a wall of somebody else's bad decision. I climbed out and walked toward the mailbox, noticing the concrete was still light gray, barely cured, with broom marks still visible across the surface. Somebody had poured this only a day or two earlier. A laminated notice had been zip-tied to the mailbox. In bright blue letters it read, "Community Streetscape Enhancement Project. Thank you for your patience during these exciting neighborhood improvements." I read it twice, then laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes when you're angry enough, your brain doesn't know what else to do. "Patience," I said out loud. You buried my driveway. I looked down at the edge of the sidewalk where a few pieces of old gravel still poked through the concrete. Seeing those little stones hit me harder than I expected. Most people would have just seen gravel. I saw my dad standing beside an old dump trailer on a humid July afternoon, teaching me how to rake stone evenly before the county truck rolled through to compact it. I remembered my grandfather wiping sweat off his forehead with an old red bandana while telling me that a driveway wasn't just a place to park a truck. "It's the welcome home," he'd said. "Every road worth driving and somewhere that matters." I hadn't thought about those words in years. Standing there looking at fresh concrete covering all those memories, they came rushing back like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed on the notice. A woman answered after 2 rings with the kind of cheerful customer service voice that always sounds rehearsed. "Good afternoon, Briar Hills Community Association. This is Melissa speaking. How may I help you today?" I took a slow breath because I already knew yelling wouldn't solve anything. "Hi, my name's Nathan Cole. I just got home from a business trip, and somebody poured a sidewalk across my driveway." She didn't even hesitate. "Oh yes, Mr. Cole. We've been expecting your call." That sentence immediately rubbed me the wrong way. "You've been expecting it?" The board approved the entrance improvement project during last month's meeting. "Improvement?" I asked. "My truck is trapped in my yard." She spoke with the confidence of someone reading from prepared notes. "Several homeowners had expressed concerns regarding the visual consistency of your gravel entrance. The architectural committee voted to extend the neighborhood sidewalk for a more unified appearance." I blinked. Did anyone think maybe they should ask the guy who owns the property? There was a short pause before she answered, almost like she couldn't understand why I'd ask such a question. "Well, Mr. Cole, sometimes individual preferences need to be balanced with what's best for the community." There it was. Community. That word. I'd heard it every few months ever since the subdivision was built next to my family's land. Community standards. Community appearance. Community values. Somehow the word community always seemed to mean everybody else's opinion carried more weight than my property rights. Let me ask you something, I said. Is my property part of your homeowners association? Well, no. Have I ever signed your covenants? No. Have I ever paid a single dollar in HOA dues? No. Then how exactly did your board decide they could redesign my entrance? The silence on the other end lasted several seconds before she finally answered. The board believed it was necessary. Necessary. Another interesting word. Funny how people always find complicated words when they're trying to justify simple trespassing. I thanked her for her time, hung up, and stood there looking across my front yard. The wind rustled through the oak trees exactly the way it always had. Birds were singing. Duke came running from behind the barn, happy to see me, completely unaware that anything had changed. Animals have a way of reminding you what's important. He didn't care about sidewalks or landscaping or neighborhood aesthetics. He just wanted his owner home. I scratched behind his ears, grabbed my suitcase from the truck parked out on the road, and carried it across the lawn because I couldn't even drive onto my own property anymore. As I walked, I noticed fresh tire tracks from construction equipment cutting across the grass near the ditch. They hadn't just covered the driveway. They'd driven heavy machinery across land that had belonged to my family since long before that subdivision even existed. My grandfather bought these 12 acres back in 1967, when this whole area was nothing but cattle fields, old pecan trees, and dirt roads. Back then, nobody cared whether your fence matched your neighbor's shutters because there weren't any neighbors close enough to complain. Years later, developers showed up with glossy brochures, promises of peaceful suburban living, and eventually a homeowners association determined to regulate everything from mailbox colors to holiday decorations. They invited us to join when the neighborhood opened. My grandfather politely declined. My father declined again after he passed away. And after my father was gone, I kept doing exactly what they'd done. We wished them well, respected their property, and expected the same courtesy in return. Apparently, that arrangement bothered certain people more than I'd ever realized. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the fresh concrete orange. It should have been a peaceful view. Instead, it felt like somebody had painted over part of my family's history. I kept thinking about one question that refused to leave my mind. They hadn't just made a mistake. They'd made a decision. Decisions require meetings. Meetings require votes. Votes require people looking at maps, permits, and plans. Somewhere along the way, several grown adults had looked at my driveway and convinced themselves they had every right to erase it while I was out of town. That wasn't carelessness. That was confidence. And confidence has a funny way of disappearing the moment it runs into facts. Around 10 that night, I walked down to the end of what used to be my driveway one more time. The concrete had almost completely cured now. I knelt down, picked up one loose piece of gravel sticking out along the edge, rolled it between my fingers, and remembered something my grandfather used to tell me whenever someone underestimated him. He'd smile, tap the side of his head, and say, "Son, land doesn't forget." People do. At the time, I always thought he was talking about memories. The next morning, I was about to find out he had been talking about something much, much bigger. I expected to spend maybe 20 minutes at the county records office, get a copy of my survey, confirm the obvious, and head home angry enough to call an attorney. Instead, I ended up spending almost the entire day there because the deeper we dug, the stranger the story became. The clerk who helped me was an older man named Walter, the kind of guy who had probably forgotten more about property records than most lawyers would ever learn. He listened quietly while I explained what had happened, then pulled a stack of subdivision plats, aerial photographs, and survey maps from shelves that looked older than I was. "People think land changes," he said as he spread one of the maps across the table. "Most of the time, it's just the paperwork that gets forgotten." We compared the current subdivision map with one recorded nearly 30 years earlier, then another filed before Pine Ridge Estates even existed. At first, nothing jumped out at me, but Walter kept tracing the same narrow strip along the front of my property with a pencil. Finally, he stopped and looked over his glasses. "Your driveway isn't where they think it is," he said. "Actually, none of this frontage is." My stomach tightened. He pointed to an easement agreement recorded decades before the neighborhood had ever been built. My grandfather had refused to sell the frontage when the developers first approached him. Instead, he negotiated an access agreement that protected our entrance while allowing future road improvements nearby. Every signature had been notarized. Every page had been properly recorded. Every boundary was still valid. The problem wasn't the paperwork. The problem was that nobody on the HOA board had bothered to read it. I left with certified copies under my arm and drove straight home, where I spent the evening digging through old file cabinets in my father's workshop. My family had always kept records, not because we expected trouble, but because my grandfather believed memories faded while documents didn't. Sure enough, tucked inside a weathered accordion folder labeled County Correspondence, I found letters between my grandfather and the original developer discussing the exact entrance they had just buried beneath fresh concrete. Reading those letters almost felt like hearing his voice again. He wasn't argumentative. He wasn't paranoid. He was simply careful. He knew that one day somebody might forget the agreement, so he made sure the courthouse never would. Over the next few days, I stopped thinking about revenge and started thinking about accountability. Every evening after work, I highlighted survey notes, compared legal descriptions, and organized timelines until my dining room table looked more like a title company's office than somebody's home. Meanwhile, the HOA continued acting like nothing unusual had happened. Construction wrapped up. Landscaping crews planted decorative shrubs beside the new sidewalk. Residents complimented the improvements on social media. A few even posted pictures celebrating the board's commitment to beautification. Every time I saw one of those photos, all I could think about was the fact that nobody had asked permission before celebrating someone else's property. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Holloway, who lived near the subdivision entrance, knocked on my door carrying a peach pie she'd baked herself. She looked uncomfortable before she even spoke. "I wanted you to know," she said quietly. Not everybody agreed with what they did. We sat on the porch while she explained that several homeowners had questioned whether the board should touch my driveway at all. According to her, one board member insisted it would send the wrong message if my gravel entrance remained beside the new sidewalk because it made the neighborhood appear unfinished. Another argued that since I wasn't part of the HOA, nobody needed my approval. Listening to her, I realized this hadn't been a simple mistake. It had been a conscious decision made by people who believed appearances mattered more than property rights. Before leaving, she hesitated, then added one last detail. "Richard wanted it finished before you came home from your business trip." I looked at her. "He knew I was gone?" She nodded. "Everyone knew." After she left, I just stood there in the yard looking at the sidewalk. Somehow that hurt more than anything else. They hadn't acted because they were in a hurry. They had waited until I wasn't around to object. That following Monday, I attended the HOA's monthly board meeting during the public comment period. The room fell quiet the second I walked inside. Richard Collins, the board president, gave me a smile that looked practiced instead of genuine. "Mr. Walker," he said, "what can we do for you?" I laid certified copies of the surveys across the conference table. "You can explain why your contractor poured concrete across private property." Richard barely glanced at the paperwork before answering. "Our engineers followed approved plans." "Then your plans were wrong." He slid the documents toward the association attorney, who spent nearly a full minute reading them without saying a word. Finally, the attorney cleared his throat. "Richard, where did these come from?" "The county," I answered before Richard could speak. The attorney looked back down at the surveys, then quietly asked, "Do we have certified copies of our own?" Nobody answered. That silence said everything. Richard tried recovering his confidence. "Even if there was some misunderstanding, surely we can resolve this reasonably." I leaned forward. Reasonably would have been knocking on my front door before burying my driveway. Nobody laughed. Nobody argued. Several homeowners sitting in the audience exchanged nervous looks. For the first time, I could see doubt spreading through the room. They had spent months believing one version of the story, and in less than 10 minutes the paperwork had started telling another. As I stood to leave, the attorney asked if I'd be willing to meet privately later that week. "I'd rather meet beside my driveway," I replied. "Once it's uncovered." Walking back to my truck, I felt something I hadn't experienced since returning from Dallas. Peace. Not because the situation was fixed. It wasn't. But because facts have a way of slowing down people who are used to winning arguments with confidence alone. The board still thought this was about a driveway. They were about to learn it was really about responsibility, and before the week was over they would discover that repairing concrete was going to be the easiest part of cleaning up the mess they had created. By Friday morning the entire tone had changed. A week earlier, the board had acted like I was nothing more than a stubborn neighbor standing in the way of progress. Now their attorney was asking if I could meet somewhere informal, as if a friendly conversation over coffee might somehow erase what had happened. We met at a small diner just outside town, the kind of place where the waitress already knew what you wanted before you sat down. He arrived carrying a leather folder thick enough to tell me this wasn't going to be a casual chat. After a few minutes of small talk, he finally sighed and said, "Mr. Walker, after reviewing the surveys, permits, and meeting records, it's clear mistakes were made." I smiled politely. That's a professional way of saying your clients poured concrete across private property. He nodded. Yes, and we'd like to resolve this without litigation. I had spent enough evenings staring at legal paperwork to know that lawsuits make everyone miserable. I wasn't interested in dragging things through court for years just to prove a point. I wanted accountability, not revenge. So I slid a sheet of paper across the table. Here's what I need. Remove the sidewalk from my entrance. Restore the driveway at your expense using better materials than what was there before. Replace the damaged landscaping. Cover my transportation costs while my truck was trapped. And issue a written acknowledgement that my property is not subject to your architectural authority. He read every line carefully before looking back at me. That's actually reasonable. I thought so too, I replied. Which makes me wonder why none of this happened before someone fired up a concrete truck. 3 days later, contractors returned, but this time they weren't giving orders. They knocked on my front door first. The foreman shook my hand and said, "Where would you like the new entrance?" I almost laughed. Amazing how quickly people discover manners when lawyers start billing by the hour. Over the next week, they removed every inch of the sidewalk crossing my property, rebuilt the entrance with compacted stone beneath reinforced concrete, installed proper drainage that I never had before, and even reseeded the shoulders along the road. The finished driveway was stronger than the original, but every now and then I still caught myself missing the old gravel because memories don't transfer into fresh concrete quite as easily as people think. Not long after the repairs were finished, the HOA held its annual election. I didn't attend, but news travels fast in a small town. Several long-time board members resigned before the vote. Others simply weren't re-elected. People had started asking uncomfortable questions. Who approved construction without confirming ownership? Why weren't surveys reviewed? How many other decisions had been made with the same carelessness? Those questions mattered far more than my driveway ever did. A month later, I was mowing the front field when a little girl from the subdivision rode her bicycle over with her father walking behind her. He introduced himself, apologized for everything that had happened even though he hadn't been involved, then said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "Most of us never wanted a fight," he said. "We just assumed the board knew what it was doing." That sentence explained almost everything. Communities don't usually end up in conflict because ordinary people are cruel. They end up there because good people stop asking questions while a few confident voices make decisions for everyone else. Before they left, his daughter looked at my new driveway and said, "It's prettier now." I smiled. "Maybe," I answered, "but that's not really why it matters." She looked confused, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. She was too young to understand that the value of a piece of property isn't measured by concrete, gravel, or landscape. Sometimes it's measured by whether people believe they can take it without asking. These days, life has settled back into something close to normal. I still wave to neighbors when they drive by. Some even stop to chat. The new board has been respectful, and we've managed to build something that resembles mutual trust instead of constant tension. Every so often, I'll walk down to the end of the driveway in the evening just as the sun starts dropping behind the trees, and I'll think about my grandfather's words. Land remembers everything, people don't. I think he was only half right. Land remembers because records endure. People remember because stories endure. That's why I'm telling you this one. Not because I won, not because someone else lost, but because boundaries, whether they're drawn on paper or built through respect, only mean something if we're willing to defend them the right way. And now I'm genuinely curious what you think. If someone made a decision like that about your property without ever asking your permission, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have taken a completely different approach? Let me know down in the comments. I read far more of them than you probably think, and I'd love to hear where you believe the line between community and individual rights should really be drawn. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, Subscribe for more true-to-life neighborhood conflict stories, and share this one with someone who's ever had a neighbor, an HOA, or anyone else mistake confidence for ownership.